Daniel Rodriguez stared at the termination email in his inbox, the words "effective immediately" glowing on his screen like a neon sign announcing the end of an era. After 12 years as head of information security at Nexus Technologies, 12 years of keeping their secrets, protecting their data, and maintaining perfect silence about everything he'd witnessed, they were letting him go due to organizational restructuring. What they didn't know was that Daniel had been documenting everything for the past 5 years, ever since he'd discovered the first irregularities in their government contracts. What they especially didn't know was that he'd been waiting for exactly this moment to break his silence. The irony was almost poetic. Nexus Technologies was 3 weeks away from announcing their largest acquisition ever, a $2.8 billion purchase of Quantum Systems that would make them one of the top defense contractors in the world. The deal had been in the works for 18 months, involving complex regulatory approvals, security clearances, and financial audits that Daniel had overseen personally. He'd kept quiet about the accounting irregularities, the security violations, the questionable relationships with foreign entities, and the deliberate misrepresentation of capabilities to government clients. He'd maintained his professional discretion even when it had cost him sleep, damaged his health, and strained his marriage. But now that they'd decided his loyalty was disposable, so was his silence. Daniel opened a new email and began typing. The recipient list was carefully curated. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Defense Inspector General, the Government Accountability Office, 3 investigative journalists, and the CEO of Quantum Systems. The subject line was simple: Nexus Technologies, material information regarding pending acquisition. The email he sent that morning would ultimately result in criminal indictments, congressional hearings, the collapse of the acquisition deal, and the bankruptcy of a company that had seemed untouchable just hours before. But that morning, Daniel was simply a man who'd been pushed too far by people who'd forgotten that loyalty is a two-way street. Daniel had started at Nexus Technologies, fresh out of Carnegie Mellon, with a master's degree in cybersecurity and dreams of using his skills to protect national security. The company had been smaller then, about 200 employees focused on developing encryption software for military communications. The founder and CEO, Jonathan Sterling, had recruited him personally, promising meaningful work and the opportunity to make a real difference in protecting American interests. For the first 7 years, Nexus had lived up to those promises. Daniel had built one of the most sophisticated information security systems in the defense industry, helped win major contracts with the Pentagon and NSA, and earned a reputation as one of the most trusted professionals in a field where trust meant everything. He'd been promoted to head of information security at 29, making him one of the youngest department heads in the company's history. But things had started changing around 2019, when Sterling brought in new investors and began pushing for rapid growth. The company went public, expanded aggressively, and started taking on contracts that pushed the boundaries of what Daniel considered ethical and legal. Sterling, once focused on technical excellence and national service, became obsessed with stock prices and quarterly earnings. The first red flag had been the Meridian contract in 2020. Nexus had won a $400 million deal to provide cybersecurity consulting for a consortium of energy companies. But Daniel had discovered that several of the companies had ties to foreign governments that should have disqualified them from working with a defense contractor. When he'd raised concerns with Sterling, he'd dismissed them as geopolitical paranoia and told him to focus on technical issues rather than business relationships. The second red flag had been the financial irregularities he'd discovered while conducting routine security audits. Nexus was billing the government for work that hadn't been performed, inflating the costs of completed projects, and using subcontractors who didn't have proper security clearances. When Daniel had documented these issues in his quarterly security reports, Sterling had ordered him to remove the findings and keep them in a separate file for internal review only. By 2021, Daniel had accumulated evidence of systematic fraud, security violations, and regulatory non-compliance that should have resulted in the loss of Nexus's government contracts and possible criminal charges. But he'd also built his entire career at the company, earned a substantial salary that supported his family, and believed that he could influence change from within the organization. His wife, Maria, had been pushing him to report the problems for years. She was a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office and understood the legal implications of what Daniel was witnessing better than anyone. Their dinner conversations had become increasingly tense as Daniel struggled with the conflict between his professional obligations and his personal ethics. "You're not just covering for them anymore, Daniel," Maria had told him during one particularly difficult conversation. "You're becoming complicit. Every day you stay silent, you're helping them defraud the government and compromise national security." "It's not that simple," Daniel had replied. "I'm not just some whistleblower with an axe to grind. I'm the person responsible for fixing these problems. If I report everything now, it won't just hurt Sterling and his cronies. It'll destroy the careers of hundreds of good people who had nothing to do with the fraud." But Maria had been right, and Daniel had known it. His attempts to reform the company from within had failed completely. Sterling and his management team had become increasingly brazen in their violations, confident that Daniel's position as head of information security made him complicit in their activities and unlikely to report them. The breaking point had come 6 months ago, when Nexus had started negotiations to acquire Quantum Systems, a smaller defense contractor with cutting-edge artificial intelligence capabilities. The acquisition would give Nexus access to some of the most sensitive AI research being conducted for the military, including autonomous weapon systems and predictive battlefield analytics. Daniel had been asked to conduct the security due diligence for the acquisition, which meant reviewing Quantum Systems, personnel, and contracts to ensure they met Nexus's security standards. What he'd discovered had been deeply disturbing. Quantum had been sharing proprietary military AI research with foreign partners. Their security systems had been compromised for months, and several of their key researchers had concerning international connections. Under normal circumstances, Daniel's findings would have killed the acquisition immediately. But Sterling and his team had been so committed to the deal that they'd ordered him to minimize his concerns and focus on solvable problems rather than deal-breaking issues. When Daniel had refused to sign off on the acquisition without addressing the security problems, Sterling had threatened his job and his security clearance. "You're being paid to find solutions, not create problems," Sterling had told him during a heated meeting in his office. "This acquisition is crucial to Nexus's growth strategy, and I won't let your paranoia derail a $2.8 billion deal." That conversation had crystallized something for Daniel. He'd realized that Sterling and his team viewed him not as a security professional with fiduciary duties to the government and the company's shareholders, but as an employee whose job was to provide cover for their increasingly reckless behavior. They'd assumed that his position within the company made him too invested in its success to ever report their activities. They'd been wrong. Daniel had spent the next 6 months quietly documenting everything, copying files, recording conversations, and building a comprehensive record of Nexus's illegal activities. He'd been careful to use only his authorized access to systems and information, ensuring that his evidence would be admissible in legal proceedings. He'd also consulted with Maria about the legal protections available to whistleblowers and the proper procedures for reporting corporate fraud. The termination email had arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the Quantum acquisition was scheduled to close. Daniel had been expecting it. Sterling had been increasingly hostile toward him in recent meetings, and he'd heard rumors that he was planning to restructure the security department after the acquisition was completed. What he hadn't expected was the callous tone of the dismissal and the complete absence of any acknowledgement of his 12 years of service. Due to organizational changes following our pending acquisition, your position as head of information security will be eliminated effective immediately, the email had read. Please coordinate with HR regarding the return of company property and the transition of your responsibilities. No meeting, no explanation, no recognition of his contributions to the company's success. Just a sterile email sent while he was reviewing security reports, as if 12 years of loyalty and dedication meant nothing. Daniel had smiled as he read the email because it had given him exactly what he'd been waiting for, the moral and legal justification to break his silence. As long as he'd been employed by Nexus, he'd been constrained by professional obligations and corporate loyalty. But now that they'd terminated him, he was free to act on his conscience and his duty as a citizen. The email he composed that morning was the result of 6 months of careful preparation. He'd organized the evidence chronologically, provided clear explanations of the legal violations, and included supporting documentation that would allow investigators to verify his claims independently. Most importantly, he'd focused on the national security implications of Nexus's activities, rather than personal grievances or workplace disputes. The first section of his email detailed the financial fraud that Nexus had been perpetrating against the government. Over the past 4 years, the company had overbilled federal agencies by an estimated $180 million through inflated costs, phantom employees, and work that had never been performed. Daniel had documented specific instances where Nexus had charged the Pentagon for cybersecurity assessments that consisted of nothing more than recycled reports from previous contracts. The second section outlined the security violations that had compromised sensitive government systems. Nexus had been using foreign subcontractors for classified work, allowing personnel without proper clearances to access sensitive information, and failing to report security breaches as required by federal regulations. In one particularly egregious case, they'd allowed a Chinese national with suspected intelligence connections to work on a contract involving military satellite communications. The third section focused on the Quantum acquisition and the risks it posed to national security. Daniel detailed the security problems he'd identified at Quantum, the foreign connections of key personnel, and the potential for sensitive AI research to be compromised. He also explained how Sterling and his team had pressured him to minimize these concerns in order to avoid derailing the acquisition. The final section of the email provided context for his decision to come forward. Daniel explained his 12 years of service to Nexus, his attempts to address problems through internal channels, and his termination after refusing to compromise his professional standards. He emphasized that he was reporting these violations not out of personal animus, but out of concern for national security and his obligations as a security professional. The recipient list for the email had been carefully chosen to maximize impact while ensuring proper legal procedures. The Securities and Exchange Commission needed to know about the financial fraud before the acquisition closed, and Nexus's stock price reflected false information. The Department of Defense Inspector General needed to investigate the contract violations and security breaches that had compromised military systems. The Government Accountability Office needed to review the broader patterns of contractor fraud that Nexus's activities represented. Daniel had also included 3 investigative journalists who specialized in defense contracting and corporate fraud. He'd researched their previous work, confirmed their credibility, and provided them with enough information to begin independent investigations. The media attention would ensure that the story couldn't be buried through political or corporate pressure. Finally, he'd sent a copy to the CEO of Quantum Systems, Dr. Patricia Chen, who deserved to know about the security problems at her company and the fraudulent practices of her potential acquirer. Daniel had met Dr. Chen during the due diligence process and had been impressed by her integrity and commitment to ethical business practices. After sending the email, Daniel had sat back in his chair and felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd been carrying for 5 years. The decision to break his silence hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. He'd given Nexus every opportunity to reform its practices and address the problems he'd identified. They'd chosen to silence him instead of fixing the problems, and now they would face the consequences of that choice. The response to Daniel's email had been swift and devastating for Nexus Technologies. Within hours, multiple investigations had been launched, trading in Nexus stock had been halted, and the company's lawyers were scrambling to contain the damage. By the end of the week, the Quantum acquisition had been suspended, several executives had been placed on administrative leave, and congressional leaders were calling for hearings on contractor fraud. The SEC investigation had focused on the financial irregularities that Daniel had documented, particularly the systematic overbilling of government contracts and the misrepresentation of the company's financial condition to investors. The agency had found evidence of securities fraud, accounting violations, and insider trading that would ultimately result in criminal charges against Sterling and several other executives. The Department of Defense investigation had been even more damaging. The Pentagon had suspended all of Nexus's existing contracts pending a comprehensive security review, cutting off over $800 million in annual revenue. The investigation had confirmed Daniel's findings about unauthorized foreign access to classified information, improper use of subcontractors, and failures to report security breaches. But the most significant impact had been on the Quantum acquisition. Dr. Chen had immediately suspended the deal after receiving Daniel's email and had launched her own investigation into the security problems at her company. The due diligence process had revealed additional issues that Nexus had concealed, including compromised research data and potential industrial espionage. "I want to thank Mr. Rodriguez for his courage in bringing these issues to our attention," Dr. Chen had said in a statement announcing the suspension of the acquisition. "The security of our research and the integrity of our government contracts are more important than any business deal." The media coverage had been extensive and devastating for Nexus's reputation. The Wall Street Journal had published a front-page story detailing the company's fraudulent billing practices. The Washington Post had exposed the security violations that had compromised military communications systems. Defense News had revealed the foreign connections that should have disqualified Nexus from sensitive contracts. Sterling had tried to discredit Daniel's allegations, claiming he was a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge for his termination. But the evidence he'd provided had been too comprehensive and well documented to dismiss. Moreover, other current and former employees had begun coming forward to corroborate his claims and provide additional evidence of wrongdoing. The congressional hearings had been particularly damaging for Sterling and his management team. Daniel had testified for over 6 hours, calmly and methodically detailing the violations he'd witnessed and the evidence he'd collected. His credibility had been unassailable. He'd held a top-secret security clearance for over a decade, had no financial incentive to fabricate allegations, and had attempted to address problems through proper channels before going public. Mr. Rodriguez represents the highest traditions of public service, Congressman David Park had said during the hearings. He put his career and financial security at risk to protect our national security and the integrity of our defense procurement system. Sterling's testimony had been disastrous. He'd been evasive, contradictory, and obviously unprepared for the detailed questions about specific contracts and security violations. Several times, he'd been forced to invoke his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, which had created terrible optics for a defense contractor seeking to maintain government contracts. The financial impact on Nexus had been catastrophic. The company's stock price had fallen by over 80% in the weeks following Daniel's revelations. The suspension of government contracts had eliminated most of their revenue, forcing massive layoffs and the closure of several facilities. The legal costs of defending against multiple investigations and lawsuits had drained their cash reserves. But the human cost had been significant as well. Hundreds of innocent employees had lost their jobs, shareholders had lost billions in value, and the defense contracting industry had suffered another blow to its already damaged reputation. Daniel had been deeply troubled by these consequences, even though he knew they were the inevitable result of Sterling's misconduct rather than his decision to report it. Maria had been incredibly supportive throughout the ordeal, helping Daniel navigate the legal complexities of whistleblower protection and dealing with the media attention his case had generated. She'd also helped him understand that the short-term costs of exposing the fraud were outweighed by the long-term benefits of preventing further damage to national security and the integrity of government contracting. "You did the right thing," she'd told him after his congressional testimony. "It took courage to speak up, and it took integrity to document everything the way you did. The system worked because people like you are willing to make it work." The legal protections for whistleblowers had indeed worked in Daniel's case. He'd received financial compensation through the SEC's whistleblower program, which provided rewards for individuals who reported securities violations. More importantly, he'd been protected from retaliation by his former employer and had received job offers from several companies that valued his integrity and expertise. 6 months after sending that fateful email, Daniel had accepted a position as Chief Information Security Officer at Meridian Defense Systems, a company known for its ethical business practices and commitment to national security. The salary was higher than what he'd earned at Nexus, but more importantly, the company's leadership had made it clear that they valued his willingness to prioritize security over profits. His new role had allowed him to help other companies improve their security practices and avoid the problems that had destroyed Nexus. He'd become a sought-after speaker at industry conferences, sharing his experience and encouraging other security professionals to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. "Security professionals have a special obligation to our country and our profession," he'd said during a keynote address at the annual Cybersecurity Summit. "We're not just employees, we're guardians of sensitive information and critical systems. When we see violations of security or ethics, we have a duty to act." The Nexus case had also led to broader reforms in defense contracting oversight. Congress had passed new legislation strengthening whistleblower protections and requiring more rigorous security reviews of contractor facilities. The Pentagon had implemented new procedures for reporting and investigating security breaches, and the SEC had increased penalties for contractors who defrauded the government. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome for Daniel had been the criminal convictions of Sterling and 3 other Nexus executives. They'd been sentenced to prison terms ranging from 3 to 7 years and had been ordered to pay millions in restitution to the government and investors they'd defrauded. Sterling himself had received the maximum sentence and had been permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any public company. During the sentencing hearing, Sterling had finally acknowledged the damage his actions had caused. "I let my ambition cloud my judgment," he'd said in a statement to the court. "I forgot that our mission was to serve our country, not just our shareholders. I take full responsibility for the harm I've caused to our employees, our investors, and our national security." Daniel had attended the sentencing hearing not out of vindictiveness, but out of a sense of closure. For 12 years, he'd watched Sterling compromise the values that had originally attracted him to Nexus Technologies. Seeing him held accountable for those compromises had validated his decision to break his silence, even though it had come at significant personal and professional cost. The aftermath of the Nexus scandal had been difficult for Daniel in many ways. He'd received death threats from individuals who blamed him for the company's collapse and the resulting job losses. He'd been subjected to intense media scrutiny and had to hire legal counsel to protect his privacy and his family's safety. The stress had taken a toll on his health and his marriage, requiring counseling and medical treatment. But he'd also received support from unexpected sources. Former Nexus employees had thanked him for exposing the fraud that had put their security clearances and careers at risk. Government officials had praised him for protecting sensitive information and systems. Industry colleagues had acknowledged that his actions had helped restore some credibility to a profession that had been damaged by contractor misconduct. The most meaningful recognition had come from other whistleblowers who'd found inspiration in his example. Daniel had received letters from government employees, corporate executives, and military personnel who'd been encouraged to report wrongdoing they'd witnessed. He'd become involved with several whistleblower advocacy organizations, helping to provide support and guidance to individuals facing similar ethical dilemmas. "What you did wasn't just about exposing one company's fraud," a fellow whistleblower had told him during a support group meeting. "You showed that the system can work when people with integrity are willing to use it. That gives hope to all of us who are struggling with similar situations." 2 years after sending the email that had destroyed Nexus Technologies, Daniel had been invited to testify before Congress again, this time about proposed reforms to whistleblower protection laws. His experience had informed several legislative proposals designed to strengthen protections for individuals who reported wrongdoing and to improve the procedures for investigating their claims. Whistleblowers shouldn't have to choose between their careers and their consciences, he told the Congressional Committee. "When we make it easier and safer for people to report wrongdoing, we protect not just individual rights, but also the integrity of our institutions and the security of our nation." The legislative reforms had been enacted with bipartisan support, creating stronger legal protections for whistleblowers and financial incentives for individuals who reported fraud against the government. The new laws had been named the Rodriguez Act, in recognition of Daniel's contribution to government accountability and national security. But Daniel's most important legacy had been the cultural change his actions had helped create within the defense contracting industry. Companies had strengthened their internal compliance programs, improved their security procedures, and created better channels for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. The message was clear. The days of silence and complicity were over. 5 years after the Nexus scandal, Daniel had been promoted to Senior Vice President of Cybersecurity at Meridian Defense Systems, overseeing security operations for the entire company. He'd built one of the most respected security programs in the industry, based on the principle that transparency and accountability were essential to effective security. His team had become known for its ethical standards and professional excellence, attracting some of the best talent in the cybersecurity field. Several of his former colleagues from Nexus had joined Meridian, grateful for the opportunity to work in an environment where integrity was valued over profits. The defense contracting industry was healthier and more accountable because of the reforms that had followed the Nexus scandal. Companies were more careful about their security practices, more transparent in their government dealings, and more responsive to employee concerns about ethical violations. The changes hadn't eliminated all problems, but they'd created a culture where wrongdoing was more likely to be reported and addressed. Daniel's marriage to Maria had grown stronger through the ordeal, deepened by their shared commitment to public service and ethical conduct. They'd had difficult conversations about the personal costs of his decision to come forward, but they'd also found meaning in the positive changes that had resulted from his courage. Their children, now in high school, had grown up understanding the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Daniel had been careful not to make them feel burdened by his experience, but he'd also wanted them to understand that integrity sometimes requires sacrifice. "Your father is a hero," Maria had told them during a family dinner on the 5th anniversary of the Nexus revelations. "He gave up a comfortable job and risked his career to protect our country's security." That's what real courage looks like. Daniel had been uncomfortable with the hero label, preferring to think of himself as someone who'd simply done his job as a security professional and a citizen. But he'd also come to understand that his actions had had a broader impact than he'd initially realized. The email he'd sent that Tuesday morning had done more than expose one company's fraud. It had demonstrated that institutions could be held accountable when individuals were willing to speak truth to power. It had shown that the system of checks and balances could work when people with access to information were willing to use it responsibly. As Daniel reflected on the journey that had begun with his termination from Nexus Technologies, he realized that Sterling and his team had made a fundamental miscalculation. They'd assumed that his position within the company made him complicit in their activities and unlikely to report them. They'd believed that 12 years of salary and benefits had bought his permanent silence. They'd failed to understand that his loyalty had never been to Nexus Technologies as a corporate entity, but to the values and principles that had originally attracted him to the defense contracting field. When the company had abandoned those values, his loyalty had shifted to the larger obligations he felt as a security professional and an American citizen. The termination email that had seemed like the end of his career had actually been the beginning of his most important professional contribution. By firing him, Sterling had freed him from the constraints of corporate loyalty and given him the moral authority to speak out about the violations he'd witnessed. 10 years later, Daniel Rodriguez had become one of the most respected voices in cybersecurity and government accountability. He'd written a book about his experience, taught courses on ethics in cybersecurity, and served on several boards and commissions focused on contractor oversight and whistleblower protection. But he'd never forgotten the lesson of that Tuesday morning when he'd received his termination email and realized that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is simply telling the truth. The email he'd sent in response had been just 2,147 words long, but it had toppled a multi-billion-dollar company, sent executives to prison, and helped reform an entire industry. The power hadn't come from anger or revenge, but from facts, documentation, and a willingness to put principle above personal comfort. Daniel had learned that silence in the face of wrongdoing isn't loyalty, it's complicity. And when people in positions of trust finally decide to break that silence, the consequences can be more far-reaching than anyone imagines. That single email had proven that even the most powerful organizations are vulnerable to the truth, and that individuals with integrity and courage can still hold institutions accountable for their actions. It was a lesson that Daniel hoped would inspire others facing similar ethical dilemmas, and a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to stay quiet any longer.